At the beginning, a large tiger was brought to the zoo after being rescued from a distant, remote forest. The tiger, though majestic and powerful, was visibly disoriented and anxious in its new surroundings. It was a creature of the wild, accustomed to the vast open spaces and freedom of the jungle, and now it found itself enclosed in a small, unfamiliar enclosure. The tiger's sharp eyes constantly scanned its environment, filled with wariness and suspicion. It recoiled at the sight of the zookeepers, every sound or movement seeming to send it into a state of heightened alert. The zookeepers, who were seasoned and had worked with various wild animals over the years, couldn't help but feel a sense of unease themselves. They knew the importance of building trust with such a creature, but the tiger's hostile stance made it clear that gaining its trust would be a long and delicate process. They approached cautiously, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, but the tiger remained distant, unwilling to allow anyone to get too close. Its body language spoke volumes, ears flattened, tail flicking with tension, every muscle coiled in readiness to either flee or fight. The zoo staff, while experienced, felt the weight of the challenge ahead. The tiger was not just an animal to care for, but a living being whose heart and mind would need to be won over with time and patience. The turning point came during one of the tiger's feeding sessions. As it eagerly tore into a large bone, it unknowingly lodged a sizable chunk deep between its teeth. At first, the zookeepers were not overly concerned. They assumed that, given time, the bone would naturally loosen and fall out, allowing the tiger to go on with its day. However, after 3 long days of watching the tiger's increasingly distressed behavior, it became clear that something was wrong. The tiger's demeanor had shifted. It no longer ate with the same vigor. Instead, it had become visibly irritated and uncomfortable. Every movement seemed labored, and it would frequently paw at its mouth, growling softly in frustration. The once proud, fierce creature now seemed vulnerable and pained, and it was clear to the zookeepers that the situation had escalated beyond a simple inconvenience. The staff, who had been careful to respect the tiger's boundaries, now faced a difficult choice. They had to act swiftly to relieve its discomfort, but they also knew they couldn't approach the tiger aggressively. It was still too wary and defensive. One senior zookeeper, with years of experience working with animals, stepped forward. He recognized the severity of the situation and decided to take action. Despite the tiger's natural mistrust of humans, he knew that he needed to sedate it to prevent further suffering and to carefully remove the bone. With a steady hand and a calm demeanor, he administered the sedative, speaking softly to the tiger as it slowly drifted into unconsciousness. There was a palpable tension in the air as the team gathered around, preparing for the delicate procedure. The zookeeper worked meticulously, his hands steady despite the tiger's powerful frame. With patience and precision, he gently worked to remove the lodged bone, ensuring that no further injury would be caused. The entire process took several hours, but finally, the bone was dislodged, and the tiger was safely returned to its resting place. When the tiger awoke, disoriented but no longer in pain, there was a noticeable shift in its behavior. The anger and distrust that had once filled its gaze were replaced with something softer, something more accepting. It lay there quietly, its body relaxed, as if understanding that these humans, who had been a source of fear before, had now become its caretakers, its protectors. The zookeepers could not help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the tiger's relationship with them, one built on mutual trust and care. The turning point came when one of the senior zookeepers, a man with decades of experience in handling wild animals, noticed that the tiger's condition had worsened. For 3 days, the tiger had struggled with the large bone lodged between its teeth, and despite the zookeeper's hopes that it would eventually dislodge itself, it hadn't happened. The tiger's once powerful and confident demeanor was now clouded with discomfort and frustration. It refused to eat, pacing restlessly in its enclosure, occasionally pawing at its mouth in an attempt to dislodge the bone. The growls and huffs it emitted were laced with pain and irritation, signaling that the situation had become urgent. The zookeepers could see that the tiger was becoming increasingly weak and distressed. It was no longer the majestic, intimidating creature that had arrived. Now, it appeared vulnerable and in desperate need of help. The senior zookeeper, who had seen many animals come and go in his years at the zoo, knew that the time to act had come. He had watched the tiger closely for several days, recognizing that the animal was not just physically suffering, but emotionally worn down. He understood that the tiger's natural wariness of humans, especially after such a traumatic experience, would make the situation even more challenging. But the zookeeper couldn't wait any longer. He had to intervene, not only to relieve the tiger's pain but to prevent any further harm. With a deep breath, the senior zookeeper decided to sedate the tiger. He knew the procedure would be delicate, but he also knew that it was the only option. He gathered the necessary tools and approached the tiger cautiously, speaking in a calm, soothing voice. He wasn't sure the tiger would respond to his voice, but he hoped it would provide some comfort. As he drew closer, the tiger's sharp eyes flicked toward him, still full of distrust and fear. But the zookeeper didn't flinch. He had worked with wild animals long enough to understand that it wasn't just the body that needed care, but the spirit as well. He injected the sedative carefully, watching as the tiger's powerful form began to relax and its eyes gradually closed. The process was slow, but the zookeeper remained steady and patient, not rushing the tiger, but instead giving it time to succumb to the effects of the drug. Once the tiger was fully sedated, the team moved in, working quickly yet gently to remove the bone that had caused so much pain. The senior zookeeper, with his experienced hands, worked methodically, aware of how much the tiger had suffered and determined not to cause any further distress. Every movement was deliberate, and the zookeeper's focus never wavered. He understood that this moment would not only help relieve the tiger's immediate pain but also pave the way for trust to begin to form between them. It wasn't just a physical procedure, it was the first step in healing the emotional rift between the wild animal and the humans who cared for it. The climax of the story arrived when the tiger began to stir, slowly regaining consciousness after the sedative had taken effect and the troublesome bone was finally removed. As its eyes fluttered open, the tiger was disoriented, unsure of its surroundings. At first, it seemed confused, glancing around with a mixture of uncertainty and lingering fear. It was a delicate moment. Would the tiger lash out in pain or anger, as it had done when it first arrived at the zoo, or would it remain calm? The zookeepers held their breath, carefully observing the tiger's every move. For a brief moment, the air was thick with tension, as the tiger slowly adjusted to its new state, disoriented from the sedation yet relieved from the intense pain it had endured for days. But then, something remarkable happened. The hostility and weariness that had once defined the tiger's demeanor began to dissipate. The tiger blinked a few times, focusing on the faces of the zookeepers around it. There was no longer the wild, predatory glare in its eyes, but a softening, attentive curiosity. The tiger shifted its posture, not in the defensive, crouched stance it had previously maintained, but in a more relaxed and exploratory manner. It slowly lifted its massive body, stretched out its legs, and let out a soft sigh, as if awakening from a long, painful nightmare. The zookeepers remained still, offering gentle smiles and speaking in calm, soothing tones, not wanting to startle the animal now that it seemed more at ease. The senior zookeeper, who had been the one to carefully perform the procedure, stepped closer. He spoke softly to the tiger, his voice low and reassuring, "It's all right, you're safe now." The tiger, surprisingly, didn't shy away as it had done before. Instead, it fixed its gaze on him, not with fear, but with something that could almost be described as trust, or at the very least, a willingness to accept the care he had shown. For a brief moment, it took a few tentative steps closer to the zookeeper, as if testing the waters. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the tiger stopped just a few feet away, gazing up at the man with a calm, almost contemplative expression. It was in that moment that the zookeepers realized how significant this change was. This was no longer just an animal they had to manage, it was a creature who, through the care and patience shown, had begun to open its heart, even if just a little. The senior zookeeper couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and triumph. He had known that gaining the tiger's trust would take time, but now, it seemed that the tiger was starting to understand that not all humans were a threat. Slowly but surely, the bond between the tiger and the zookeepers had started to form, and for the first time, the tiger's actions reflected a quiet acceptance. This was not just the physical healing of an animal, it was the beginning of a new relationship, one built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. As the days passed, the tiger's recovery became increasingly evident, not just physically, but emotionally as well. It had gone from a creature that was distrustful and defensive, its every movement calculated with wariness, to an animal that was learning to find comfort in the presence of the humans who had cared for it. The zookeepers observed this slow but undeniable transformation with quiet admiration, knowing how rare and delicate such a change could be in a wild animal. The process had been painstaking, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but now, there was a sense of triumph as the tiger's aggressive tendencies gave way to curiosity and trust. The senior zookeeper, who had been the one to sedate and tend to the tiger during its most difficult days, found himself reflecting on the journey the animal had been through. He had worked with countless wild creatures over the years, but there was something different about this tiger. Its strength and beauty had captivated him from the first moment he laid eyes on it, but it was the tiger's resilience that stood out the most. The zookeeper had witnessed the tiger's struggle, its hunger, its frustration, and its confusion. He had seen it fight against the pain from the bone lodged in its teeth, and the way it had recoiled from the zookeeper's attempts to help. But now, the tiger no longer flinched at the sight of them. It no longer backed away when they came close. Instead, it was learning to coexist with them, to see them not as threats, but as part of its new reality. The tiger's actions began to shift gradually, with each day bringing new signs of progress. In the beginning, it would watch the zookeepers warily from a distance, still maintaining a cautious stance, never fully trusting. But over time, it started to show small signs of interest. It would tentatively approach the edge of its enclosure, its eyes locked on the zookeepers, as if sizing them up. They, in turn, would speak in soft, gentle tones, offering food from afar, always careful not to make any sudden moves. There was a silent understanding between them. The tiger would come closer when it was ready, and the zookeepers would wait patiently, offering nothing but calm presence and care. One day, the zookeeper stood by the enclosure, watching the tiger stretch and yawn lazily in the sun, its large form gracefully unfolding. The tiger looked up at him, its eyes meeting his with an unusual softness. It wasn't the fierce, calculating stare it had once given, but something more trusting, more accepting. The zookeeper felt a deep sense of accomplishment, though it was a quiet, understated victory. There was no fanfare, no dramatic shift, just the subtle acknowledgement that the tiger had accepted its new reality. It wasn't a complete surrender to domestication, it was still a wild creature at heart, but it had begun to trust the people who had helped it through its pain, and in doing so, it had taken the first steps toward accepting the zoo as its home. The senior zookeeper couldn't help but smile to himself, a feeling of warmth spreading through him as he realized the significance of this moment. He had seen many animals come and go, but few had left such an impression on him as this tiger. It was a reminder of the delicate balance between the wild and the tamed, and of the patience and understanding required to care for creatures like this. The zookeeper understood that this bond wasn't just built on providing food or medical care, it was about building trust, one small, gentle step at a time. The tiger, though still very much wild in its instincts, had learned to coexist with the humans who cared for it. It no longer showed signs of aggression or fear. Instead, it approached the zookeepers with a cautious curiosity, as though it had finally begun to understand that these humans were not a threat. The zookeeper realized that this was a moment of quiet, mutual respect. The tiger, in its own way, had accepted the help it had been offered, and the zookeepers, too, had learned to understand the animal on a deeper level. They had learned to see beyond its fearsome exterior, to appreciate its complexity, and to respect its boundaries. Over the following weeks, the bond between the tiger and the zookeepers continued to strengthen. The tiger's movements became more confident and less guarded, and while it still maintained its majestic wildness, there was a peaceful coexistence that was now evident in its behavior. The zookeepers no longer approached with caution or fear, they moved with a sense of familiarity, knowing that the tiger had come to trust them. In the quiet moments, the senior zookeeper would stand near the enclosure, watching the tiger as it moved through its space with grace and power. There was no longer the tension that once filled the air when the tiger first arrived. It had found its place in the zoo, and the zoo had found its place in the tiger's life. There was still much to learn and many challenges to face, but for the first time, there was a feeling of peace. The tiger was no longer just a wild animal in a cage, it was a creature that had learned to trust, and in doing so, had forged a connection with the humans who cared for it. It was a small but significant victory, a testament to the power of patience, empathy, and the quiet understanding that could be built between humans and animals when they learned to trust each other.